Hello BookTube and all Repairman Jack fans, my name is Nathan, thank you so much for watching and welcome to my channel. This is my longer discussion video for book number 13 in the Repairman Jack series, Ground Zero, which was first published in 2009 by F. Paul Wilson. So, Ground Zero is preceded by the Sword. So, By the Sword is number 12 in the series, and if you have not read By the Sword before, or if you haven't read it in a while, it's worth rereading because it's really fun. There's lots of action in it. Wilson said that he went full Tarantino with By the Sword. Ground Zero is a very different book from that. Not nearly as much action in Ground Zero, but a lot more with the secret history of the world compared to By the Sword. So anyway, By the Sword comes before Ground Zero, and if I did this even a year ago, if I was talking about Ground Zero, then I would say the next book in the series is Fatal Error, but that is no longer true. The next book in the series, as far as chronology, is The Last Christmas. So I am really excited to get into this because I have not read The Last Christmas before. So I've got my copy and I'm ready to go, and now that I've read Ground Zero, I can actually move on to this. So I'm excited to read it for the first time. I want to see especially how well this fits into the series by reading, Ground Zero and then The Last Christmas and then Fatal Error in quick succession. So I'll probably end up reading all three of those in less than 10 days, maybe a week or so, to read all three of them, and I'm doing that intentionally to see how well they fit together. Because this project is a bit of an experiment to see how do you even read this series, because it's kind of hard to know what order to go in. And that's kind of where I'm at with Ground Zero and the series, is as I'm reading through it, I'm going, and I'm not sure exactly when Secret Histories came out. I should actually look it up because I'm not sure when it was published, but it's got to be right around the same time as Ground Zero, because there's so many references to Ground Zero, or so many references to the young adult series and specifically Secret Histories, because I've not read the last two in the young adult trilogy, but this book is just replete with references to the young adult series and Jack's childhood, because we've specifically got his childhood best friends with Weezy or Louise and her brother Eddie, and then even Glaken and the lady was Mrs. Clevenger, and Glaken was, I think, Mr. Thompson is what he was when growing up in Jack's hometown. They were there specifically to keep an eye on Jack, and so we have all of those references, and the lady in this even appears as Mrs. Clevenger, which Weezy recognizes immediately. So I'm looking at this and I'm going, well, I've just read Ground Zero. Does that mean that I should read Secret Histories now to try to go more in publication order? Or do I go to The Last Christmas, which is following the chronology of the series? Or do I go with the publication order, but just in the Repairman Jack series, and then move on to Fatal Error? And if you've been kind of following along with Repairman Jack for a while, then it does get a little bit confusing. And that's partially what I'm doing with this project, is to make a decision, read the books in a certain order, and then see what the result is. So I'm telling you right now, after reading Ground Zero, I'm going, I feel like I should have read Secret Histories before I read Ground Zero. So if you're kind of doing the same thing as me, if you're reading through the series, or especially if you're rereading the series, that would be my suggestion if you haven't quite got here yet. I think it would probably be worthwhile to try doing that instead of just going through the adult Repairman Jack series, if that makes sense. I hope it does. So there's a few different things that I want to talk about with this, and let me just kind of give you an overview of them. So in Ground Zero, you've got lots of conspiracies. Jack goes to Hollywood, and you get his film nerd that comes out from that. You've got Daryl and being told, so Daryl's one of the kickers, being told that he has AIDS in order to get him to essentially sacrifice himself. He doesn't actually know that, but to become the Fint Monchka, right? You get one of these Lovecraftian words that Wilson has in here, and there's a lot of Lovecraft in this book. That, just very hard to pronounce words, intentionally so. But you get Daryl and the Kickers and the Septimus Order and Ernst Drexler trying to get him to, become the Finch Montka and Rosalind pushing for that as well. I want to talk about the lady and the news sphere. There's a whole interesting new revelation to the mythology of the secret history of the world with that, and who the lady actually is. And also I want to talk about her at the very end of this book, because at the very end of this book, I don't know, I'm gonna save that. I want to talk about the ethics of abortion. That has been a theme that has come up multiple times in the series, and it's just gotten to the point, especially in this, where I'm like, okay, I just need to mention it and have a very brief discussion about it and how it's being depicted in the series. Like I say, there's a lot of references to the young adult Jack books, but I think I've already covered that. And September 11th and its impact on the series, Lovecraft. So those are all the things that I want to get to, and I'll try to be as brief as possible with each one. So just a general overview with this book. I'll give you a fairly quick plot summary. Basically, Jack is contacted by who he thinks is a regular client, somebody that he's just never met before, this guy Eddie, whose sister is missing. Jack agrees to help this guy. Then he recognizes him. Hey, it's one of my best friends from my childhood, Eddie. And he's like, oh man, it's Louise or Weezy who is missing. Jack ends up figuring out what's happened, that, you know, she was hit by a car, finds her at the hospital, and Eddie kind of gives Jack all of this backstory of what's been going on with Weezy. So she was previously married, her husband committed suicide. She then becomes deeply involved in the 9/11 truther movement, except she's got a theory that other 9/11 truthers just don't have. She believes that there's something going on behind all of the conspiracies, sort of like a big grand conspiracy or a secret history of the world behind those smaller conspiracies. So as part of it, it's believed that she's upset somebody because she's actually figured out the truth of what happened with September 11th, and therefore whoever is behind this is coming after her. As we continue reading, we realize that's exactly what's going on. So as part of this, what you learn is that ultimately, like as you get to the end of the book, Rosalind is behind all of this, and he's been using the Septimus Order to orchestrate 9/11, that Rosalind was there to convince Osama bin Laden and the terrorists, the hijackers, to do this, to attack the World Trade Center. And the reason why is because you find out that it was the original, I believe it's called null point of Operation Opus Omega, which we saw with the Dormentalists, with, I think that's Infernal is where we get that. And you get the null point is the very first pillar that was planted, and it was planted at the site of the World Trade Center. So it had already been planted there. But basically, the idea is, in order to get Operation Opus Omega to move forward, they would have to plant these pillars at all these key places across the earth, which will then somehow destroy the lady. If the lady is destroyed, then essentially the ally will believe that Earth no longer has sentient beings on it, that it's no longer a piece in this cosmic struggle, this conflict that's going on. So the idea of Operation Opus Omega is to plant these pillars across the earth, which will then kill off the lady, and therefore the ally will retreat from it. Glaken will have no power. Rosalind and the otherness can just take over, and you get Night World, is essentially the idea behind this. However, they realize there's places on Earth where they have to plant these things, like in the middle of the ocean, that it's just like, we can't do it. We don't have the ability to do it. So you get this plan B, which is the Finch-Monka. I don't know. Fint-Monka? Honestly, I don't know how to pronounce it. And like I say, that's intentional. That if you retrieve the first pillar that was planted at the null point, right where the World Trade Center is, if you can retrieve that and then essentially get somebody to go inside it, and going through all of this mythology, but it's never been tried before, that will be a way to destroy they don't quite know it yet, it ultimately destroys the lady, is the plan. But the idea behind it is that it will act as a catalyst that will then allow the otherness to take over Earth. That's basically what happens in Ground Zero. So they do this. Ernst Drexler, who's in charge of the Septimus Order, he convinces Daryl, who's Hank Thompson's right-hand man with the kickers, tells him he sees that he's sick, tells him that he has to go see a doctor. The doctor then says, hey, you've got cancer, it's treatable, but the real issue is that you have AIDS. So then Drexler then tells Daryl, hey, if you go inside this thing, it can cure you of everything. Anything that's wrong with your body can cure you, in order to get Daryl to go in. So he goes in there for several days, emerges as this whole other being, completely transformed, where he now is essentially not of this earth. And then everything he touches that's of this earth just essentially disintegrates, just ceases to exist. And then he goes after the lady, right? The lady and the dog, who's there in Central Park with Weezy at the end. Jack tries to stop this guy. The lady can't see him because she can only perceive things of this earth because she's part of the news sphere. She's essentially a manifestation of the collective consciousness of human beings on Earth. And that, therefore, since she is such a manifestation of Earth itself and human beings and our consciousness, she can't perceive some of the stuff that the otherness is doing because it's not of this world, right? So she doesn't even see what's happening, and then the guy, basically Daryl, the Finch Monka, tackles her, and they explode. Daryl's then just gone. The lady does return, but with no dog, and she's incredibly damaged, and she specifically says at the end of the book that, you know, if she takes one more hit like that, there's no coming back. So she already took one at the end of Gateways, when she was, taking on the identity of Anya. And then with the chew wasps that go after her and destroy her and just leave the flayed skin on her back, that was like the first blow. Now the Finch Monka is the second blow, and basically if there's a third one, she's done. If she's done, then the ally will give up on Earth itself. So you now have to protect her. She's at Glycan's house, at his condo in one, like a floor just below him and Magda. And that's basically what you have with Ground Zero. So the action in Ground Zero is front-loaded because so much of it is really about the secret history of the world, getting into the mythos, the mythology, and the lore of the Wilson universe, of this whole secret history of the world. And so there's very, very little action in this book, and what action there is mostly at the beginning. Aside from that, the only real action that we see is Jack desperately trying to fight off Daryl at the end, but, unsuccessfully. So it's interesting coming off of By the Sword, which is the most violent book in the series, and then we get into maybe the least violent, if not the least. It's got a rank fairly low in terms of the level of violence that we have, which I'm not saying is a bad thing. I'm just saying it's a thing. It's something that you should note. All right. Now, the book, even though it's called Ground Zero, and there's so much to talk about with that. And I know that 9/11, September 11th, the terrorist attacks played a big role in the series, that it really changes the tone and some of the villains and the depiction of some villains that we get in the series. And Wilson has, as best I can tell, I by no means have read or listened to every interview he's done, but I've heard enough that I know that he has said that he had to account for that. And that changed things, right? Because as he was writing the series, there's basically the pre-9/11 world and the post-9/11 world, and especially if you're talking about the early 2000s, right? I've worked as a high school teacher a fair bit, including teaching history, and teaching students now about September 11th, when they literally were born after the attacks. They don't necessarily think about this in terms of a post-9/11 world, but for everybody who is old enough to remember, you know exactly what I'm talking about, of how everything changed in terms of mood and worldview. That for a while there, everything was so uncertain of what can you trust, what will be next. And then, that of course led to a whole bunch of terrorist attacks in the early 2000s in different nations. And so what's interesting is that Wilson is dealing with the 9/11 truther movement. And he is actually saying that Rosalind was behind it, along with the Septimus Order, and that this was planned all along, and that it was a controlled demolition. But, really behind all of it, it wasn't just Osama bin Laden, it wasn't just Drexler and the Septimus Order, that there was this conspiracy even behind those conspiracies, which really is Rosalind to get back to the null point to dig up the original column that was planted there. Now, it's interesting that Wilson is doing that. So in the Repairman Jack books, as far as what's canon, what's actually happened with like the real history of the world or the secret history of the world, September 11th, there was a lot more going on than just Osama bin Laden. Now, I included something like that in my book, in Orphans of Liberty, and I've had at least one person who attacked me for it. Like, it was just a criticism, not an attack, but who said, like, how dare you say that there's some alternative explanation for what happened. And look, it was fiction, right? I'm not commenting on it one way or the other. I'm not saying that Wilson is. It's just interesting in the Repairman Jack story world that there is. And that's kind of like my thinking. I went, right, well, that makes sense, because Wilson is trying to account for every big event that's happened in the world, and to say that history that you think you know, there's actually a secret history behind it. Most of what we think of as history is false history, right? Fake history, so to speak. That there's a real history. And the real history is the conflict between the ally and the otherness. So when you have a massive event like September 11th that happens in, fairly early on in the Repairman Jack series, but as far as the chronology itself of the series, because Night World, I think, is taking place in like 2003, I want to say. I think it's 2003. I think, it's got to be the spring of 2003, that Wilson has to account for this. It's too big of an event to not incorporate into the secret history of the world. And so that's an interesting thing, that when you think about that he's conceived of this entire story universe where he has to come up with reasons why events happen, but alternative reasons and the real reasons why certain historical events happened the way they did. So that's what you get with September 11th and the impact on the series, which is really interesting. So you get a lot of conspiracies in this, and this is, Wilson wrote, like, book number 3 in the series is conspiracies itself. He's obviously interested in conspiracies, so it's an interesting thing to kind of come back to this. All right. The next thing, and this will be fairly brief, Jack goes to Hollywood. So that's fun. Like, Jack actually flies out to Hollywood to talk to one of the workers, one of the first responders who was at the site of the World Trade Center after the attacks to try to find survivors, and saw something that he should not have seen, which was specifically them pulling out the column. And it's presumed that it was Drexler or Rosalind, I can't remember, but because he doesn't quite see who it is. It says it's a man in white, so I'm assuming it's Drexler, but it might have been Rosalind who was there as well. He sees what he shouldn't see. His wife then dies. He goes on the run. So Jack goes out to Hollywood, where he's now living kind of under the radar, to talk to him to figure out what's happened, because Weezy is saying, hey, this guy should know what's going on. And it's an interesting little side story that we get. It's one of the days in the book, maybe like a 30, 40 page chapter, so to speak, right? Because of how they're broken up into days. And it seems like a big part of it is for Jack to nerd out on how much he's into film history and to get to tour Hollywood and filming locations. And, it reads like a very short travel log. And I've said that before with Gateways, but the more I read the series, the more I realize that Wilson just does that in general. He writes these books as travel logs. And what I mean by that is essentially an explanation of how a tourist would view the city. Think about the way he writes about New York City. That he gives you specific addresses, he tells you specific things about neighborhoods, demographics, the type of restaurants, cuisine that you can find there, different tourist attractions, and in different parts of the city. He writes it very much for somebody who is planning a visit and saying, hey, you might want to check this out. Hey, you might want to check this out. Hey, you probably want to avoid this. Right? But they very much, the books in general, read like a travel log, but because they're so focused on New York City, I didn't really catch it until this time that I'm rereading the series. And I caught it in Gateways, and you definitely get it here in Ground Zero when Jack goes out to Hollywood. So it's a funny little thing. The other thing, though, is that Jack, when he first arrives, realizes, because he has this love for film history, but we haven't seen that in a while. And he thinks about that and he goes, man, how long has it been since I've done my own film festival at my apartment, selecting it by actor or director or what have you, and then watching a whole bunch of movies in a fairly short amount of time, and realizing that the conflict has taken over his life and he has lost that as a hobby, right? That's part of it. And I think also, he obviously doesn't have any room in his life for this anymore. And so this is a little reprieve for him. But his life, in addition to the conflict, which has really taken over his life, he's also now much more seriously involved with Gia and Vicky, and the idea of saying to Gia, hey, I'm just going to sit by myself in my own apartment and watch movies for 3 days straight. I'm not going to see you. It probably would not go over well. So I think that's part of it that Jack is not necessarily accounting for. He's blaming it all on the conflict, and certainly it's affected him emotionally and psychologically, where he's so distracted by this and tormented by what's going on in his role in all of this and losing family members and all of this. And there's signs of depression, which we've seen multiple times, and which makes perfect sense because there's grieving and losing these family members. So all of that. But you do get a little bit of a reprieve for Jack to kind of nerd out on Hollywood and film history and all of that. Okay, the next thing, Daryl and his diagnosis of having AIDS. Now, that's an interesting part of the book because, as far as I can tell, there's no explanation. I was paying fairly close attention, but it is possible that I missed it. I just assumed, rereading it, that Drexler paid off this doctor, or the doctor was part of the order, and Drexler told the doctor, tell this man that he has AIDS, even though he actually doesn't. That whatever was going on with Daryl's arm, right, because he's got some kind of discoloration on the arm, that's what prompts Drexler to say, hey, you need to go and get checked out. So Daryl then goes and gets checked out and finds out he's got a type of cancer, but I believe it's said that it's treatable, but then he says, but your real issue is that you have AIDS. This is all to convince Daryl to go into the, what is it called? The Orsa, I think it's what it's called, before it turns into before he is transformed into the Finch Montka. And, to get him to go into this thing in the basement of the lodge, then you have to convince him that he must do this, that he has no other choice. But I feel like he didn't actually have AIDS. I don't even know if he necessarily had cancer. It could have been just some kind of, skin irritation or bacterial infection, or I don't know what, right? Wilson is actually like a physician, so I'm sure he could have come up with something, but we never get an explanation for that. So I want to know what you think. Do you think, I gotta believe, and I feel like if you think about it, then you would have to believe as well that Daryl did not actually have AIDS, but it's just weird that as far as I can tell, it doesn't come up that he's been tricked in some way. And you would think that there would be some revelation or at least confirmation of what we all suspect, but there isn't, which is fine. It's surprising. Okay, I guess yeah, I might as well talk about this now. The lady, you know, the lady, Jack's mother, everybody's mother, right? The lady and the dog. And the end of this book. I have not been highly critical of the books, generally speaking. And that's because I think there's not a lot, as in terms of my own taste, there's very, very little that I dislike. Like a tiny, almost insignificant amount where I go, ooh, I don't quite like that. I've pointed out a couple things. Like, I don't like the way when there's an action scene and Jack is really feeling pressured, that Wilson starts using sentence fragments, which is basically screenwriting action tags to describe what's going on. I'm not a fan of that, but I understand why. It's to get the reader to feel a sense of urgency, to increase the tension and the excitement level. I personally don't like that. So that's like a little criticism that I've had. But generally speaking, I have very, very little to criticize with the series. But at the very end of this book, I just don't... It's fine. I can handle this, but Daryl, as the Finch Monka, arrives in Central Park, absolutely deranged, crazy. It's a commotion the entire way through, the streets of New York along his pathway, where you've got Thompson and Drexler trying to get people out of the way. And this guy is just saying, mother, 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 to try to get after the lady and then to be able to grab her and to just kill both of them is what we realize is supposed to happen here. So it's pandemonium. It's craziness. You look at what's going on here. Jack is attacking this guy with this huge branch. He's swinging it. And the lady does nothing because she can't see Daryl. But even if she can't see Daryl, to me, it seems inconsistent with her character, with what we've seen so far. So Jack runs up. Daryl's coming after her, and Jack says, "Weezy," Jack shouted. "Get her out of here." "Whatever's Jack doing?" the lady said. Weezy scrambled to her feet. "I don't know, but I'm sure he had a very good reason for attacking that man." "What man?" Weezy turned to her. She was staring at Jack and obviously saw him, but... "The man in the dirty work shirt," she pointed. "Can't you see him? He's right there." The lady shook her head. "No, I see Jack swinging a dead branch." The dog sensed something. He was on his 3 legs, baring his teeth as the fur rose along his back. And then it continues on. Weezy says, "Oh my God, what just happened there?" the lady said. At least she'd seen that, and then Weezy remembered a remark she'd made earlier, because basically what happens is Jack thrust the branch between the stranger's legs. The man pitched forward onto his hands and knees. Weezy jumped as she saw the wet ground near the water erupt in steam and seemed to dissolve where his palms landed. So the lady can see evidence of stuff. She must see that Jack is swinging this branch and he's not doing a full motion, that it's stopping as though it's hitting an object, even if she can't see it. She refuses to move. She refuses to leave. The dog is sensing something. And then it says, Weezy tugged the lady to her feet. "We've got to get away." "I don't understand." "Look," she said, pointing to the dog who had placed himself between the lady and the stranger. "He does." And she just continues to not leave. Then, the dog goes after Daryl and essentially attacks him, but dies in the process. The water exploded into jets of steam, shooting high and wide, its roiling billows blotting out the man and the pond and even the castle. "Oh no," the lady cried, rushing toward where the dog lay on its side on the grass. "What happened? What happened?" Weezy grabbed her arm. "You can't stay here." "What happened?" She doesn't leave. Jack says, "You've got to get away. You've got to get as far away as possible." "Yes," Weezy cried. "Listen to Jack." "Not without him." She slipped her arms beneath the dog. "We stay together always." So then Daryl is able to attack her, and then she dies. I really, really like the way the book ends. I like that scene. I like Jack attacking Daryl, but having no success. I like the fact that the lady can't see Daryl. I just feel like it probably would have made more sense if the lady had some intuition of what was going on, just listened to Weezy, listened to Jack, like used any context clues to see you are incredibly endangered at the moment, you need to go away, you need to get anywhere else. And the lady certainly would be capable of doing that, because it seems that she can manifest anywhere on Earth. She always has to be physically present, but she could go, as Jack says, I forget exactly where, but basically she could go to like an ice sheet in the middle of Antarctica and just hang out there and wait for Daryl to try to get to her there, and then just pop over somewhere else. For plot purposes, then Wilson needs this to happen, right? Because he's leading to, you believe that the lady is gone, you find out, no, she has come back, she has recovered, the new sphere is more powerful than whatever we thought up until this point, that it should not have been able to bring her back. But I guess the mass of people on Earth and how powerful the collective consciousness is of all of those human beings has become more powerful than anybody thought, which has brought back the lady. But she's now been attacked twice in short order, in like something like a year. She's effectively died. And she says, like, now she has no dog, right? So her male counterpart, that if she gets attacked one more time like this, if she dies one more time, then she just can't come back. And she knows that for sure. So I get that Wilson wants to get to that point. I just wish he did it in a way where it didn't make the lady seem so completely stupid. And what I mean by this is, think about Anya in Gateways. Would Anya have reacted that way at all? Right? Like, and that's, I guess, my point, is that Anya is the lady. Just, she appears as Anya in that particular case. We've interacted with her before. She's not stupid. She knows that Rosalem and the otherness are trying to destroy her. I don't get it. She knows that the Finch-Monka is real because Diana, the Oculus, has had an alarm. We know all of this stuff. So I just feel like that little bit of the book, just those like 2 to 3 pages, if they were edited just a bit to account in some other way for why the lady doesn't run away, even if it was just something like, something stopping me from, manifesting somewhere else, something, right? Some kind of explanation aside from just, what's happening? Oh no, what is Jack doing? Like, that's all that she seems to do until she's just dead. I feel like it's inconsistent with her character. I'm hesitant to bring it up because I love the end result. It's just those 2 to 3 pages of going, like, why is she acting so dumb all of a sudden? All right, so there's that. I have just a couple more points. This is also to dealing with the lady, but so basically her and Weezy, they walk past a abortion clinic. I want to try to find the exact spot here. And it's strange because so they cross the street. So this is, in my edition, this is page 393 to 394, and this is the mass market paperback edition. So they're walking down the street, the lady and Weezy. Weezy looked over her shoulder and saw a blue awning leading to glass doors. Sitchin Clinic was etched on the glass. What's wrong? There's screams. Baffled, Weezy looked again and saw Women's Center in smaller letters. Women's Center, the euphemism for abortion clinic. You can hear? The lady nodded. They linger. After that, they'd walked a ways in silence. The lady said, his heart is taking, and talking about Jack, because Weezy is in love with Jack, but Jack is obviously not interested because he's got Gia. So, abortion comes up multiple times in the series. And this is not surprising. I think if you're going to write, 20-something books dealing with the contemporary world, dealing with, a lot of crime and everything under the sun, right? These books are span genres. And you're going to be dealing with a lot of violence and death and the significance of, Dawn Pickering and the baby that she has, essentially that will be it's marked by the taint or O-DNA, full of otherness, the kickers, right? The QR, that whole kicker people, that race, all of that stuff. Okay, Dawn considers abortion a fair bit because she finds out that she has been impregnated by her own father, right? Who was her mother's brother. So her father is also her uncle, right? You get all of that in bloodline. Obviously, abortion is going to come up, and I know that it comes up in other places as well. At one point, when Gia is fairly early in her pregnancy and she tells Jack, he kind of says something, and she starts thinking. It's a subtle moment, but you can see she's thinking, oh, if Jack is even suggesting that I abort my baby, she just goes, no, I won't do that. And he goes, no. I was asking you if you wanted to, and I forget the question, but he wasn't suggesting that. Gia did kind of think for half a second, if Jack is even suggesting that I have an abortion, the answer right now is immediately no, I will not do that. And as far as the ethics of abortion, parts of the series are fairly neutral on this, like whether it's okay for Dawn to go and have an abortion or not. And you go, yeah, like the baby might bring about the end of the world, for one thing. Also impregnated through, inbreeding. So, like this incestuous creation of a baby. You go, if ever there was a reason for abortion, right? The baby might bring about the end of the world. Okay, maybe we should have that conversation, right? So wherever you line up on the issue in the fictional world that we're dealing with, that you go, yeah, that's probably a valid time, if ever, to bring up the question. But then Dawn at this point in Ground Zero is like, I am not having an abortion. She has come to love this baby, even though it's unborn. The lady then confirms within the story universe, I'm making it clear that I'm not saying that this is Wilson's position in the real world, okay? I don't know what his position is, and to be perfectly honest, I actually am not really interested in that. It's very much a wedge issue, right, is the way we typically refer to stuff like this in Canadian politics. Something that just divides people, right? And I'm not talking about whether you're pro-life or pro-choice, how you should feel about this. But within the story universe, it very much is a pro-life position that the lady is putting forth, saying these women are having abortions. That's not just, like a bunch of matter that's being destroyed. Those are human lives being destroyed. That it's not, it's not a fetus, it's an unborn baby. And it seems to be, presumably, doesn't matter at what point in the pregnancy, that the screams of them, they linger, that the lady is tapped into that. I didn't want to bring up the issue of abortion, even though it has come up multiple times in the books. But I think when you add those up within the story universe, and again, I'm making it clear that I'm not saying that Wilson is putting forth this position as some kind of policy or political statement for the real world, because that is, you have to separate the author from the narrator, from the characters, from the story universe. There's so many layers of separation. So I'm not saying that it's Wilson's position. I'm not saying that it's not his position. I'm saying it doesn't make any commentary on it. But within the story universe, it really seems to be a pro-life story universe. That settles the question in the books. Whether it settles the question for you in our world, that's your choice. But I just felt that it was necessary to bring it up because it just becomes so overt at that point. Like at this point in the series, it's so overt with the lady and the abortion clinic that I'm like, I better mention this. Okay. I think the last major discussion point that I wanted to talk about is the references that you get to Lovecraft. So Lovecraft, like, I know that Wilson has been heavily influenced by Lovecraft, and depending on which book you're reading in the series, you get more or less Lovecraftian horror in the cosmic horror sense of the series. And so on page 159 to 160, you get a really good description of Lovecraftian horror. So it says, this is Weezy who's speaking here towards the bottom of 159. She says that she's talking about how her mind and seeing all these conspiracies and the secret history of the world, because she's been tuned into this her entire life. And her mind, sometimes it tells me, sometimes it doesn't. Most times it's not important, curious at best, but sometimes it's terrifying. And this is Jack who's speaking. H.P. Lovecraft once said something about how we go mad if we knew the real truth. You mean, the most merciful thing in the world, I think, is the inability of the human mind to correlate all its contents. Is that a quote? She nodded against him. Uh-huh. Exact, I suppose. He had no doubt. Another nod. He also said the piecing together of disassociated knowledge will open up such terrifying vistas of reality and of our frightful position therein that we shall either go mad from the revelation or flee from the light into the peace and safety of a new dark age. My problem is that my brain can correlate all its contents, and it's flashing me glimpses of that terrifying reality, and I wish it weren't. And then it gets into the rest of it, into like the secret history of the world. But that's basically Lovecraft right there, that if the human mind could even conceive of what's really going on with the conflict, with this cosmic war between the ally and the otherness, and the things that exist out there, you know, leading to like what it would be with Night World if the otherness takes over and Rosalem and all this, that the human mind would just go mad from even glimpsing it, right? That's Lovecraft, and that's kind of lurking beneath the surface of the entire series. It's not, there are moments where it's overt, but it's just kind of always there in the background, and I love that about the series. I just thought that was just a great mention of Lovecraft and a description of it, of him, and of his work. Okay, a couple quick points. Let me just run through these really quick. I just wanted to point out that Weezy, she lives and thinks like Jack. When we meet her, right? Stay on the radar, don't use your real name, everybody's watching you, a lot of paranoia, all of that. I just thought, oh, that's a nice little touch. They were best friends when they were younger. She's tapped into the secret history of the world, and living like a paranoid person is not actually wrong if they really are out to get you, right? So I just thought it was a nice little touch of how they connect together. On page 35, the first time I read this book, I did not really catch the reference because I had not read The Touch, but on page 35 of my edition, then you do have a reference to the Adversary Cycle book, The Touch, of this doctor who can heal people just with a single touch, and then his patients go crazy trying to get after him, right, out on Long Island, I believe it is. I just wanted to mention that. You've got so many references to the Septimus Order that it's now become, we kind of went from the Dormentalists to the Kickers, and then what's behind all of this, kind of the cult behind the cult, is the Septimus Order, and that ties into the young adult books, which is interesting. On page 80, Wilson's got this funny little jab at doctors, and I think it's funny because he was a practicing physician. I believe he's since retired, but at the time when he was writing this, I believe he was still practicing as a physician, and it says, you heard the doctor, random neurons. Yeah, Jack had heard, but he knew doctors could be as pig-headed as anyone else, refusing to see what was dangling before their noses because it didn't fit their preconceived notions. So, I thought that was funny. A little shot at doctors. And it's not even really a shot. It's just, I think that's a sign of being a good doctor, of saying, hey, I've got my limitations. Hey, I might not always catch things, and I've got biases and blind spots. And if you're aware of those, you probably are a better physician as a result, because you understand that I might not catch this, but maybe, a second opinion, maybe another doctor, or maybe if I talk to another doctor and see what they think, right? That you can't be perfect. You can just do your very best, and the more you recognize your own limitations, the stronger you kind of ironically become. You get Jack's reaction to September 11th in this on page 129, and that's really accounting for what's going on with all of this in the series. And of course, Jack is, and I think Jack has kind of got the attitude that a lot of people had at the time, regardless of whatever you think about geopolitical affairs, international affairs, all of that, that it was just one of those, they attacked us right here, innocent people, you know, in New York City, like right where he lives, my home, and his attitude of just, you know, rage and anger and becoming defensive. And yeah, because it's I think, like I say, I think that's how most people felt immediately afterwards. It's incredibly defensive, even if you didn't have strong views on, let's say, global terrorism before that. There's a fun little reference to the mythology, like the myth of Jack in the city, the way Weezy finds him. And it's at the bottom of 141. Then she says, she sighed and said, "In all my surfing, I've picked up chatter on New York sites here and there over the years about a guy who hires out to fix things. Some people call him the Repairman, others call him Repairman Jack." Oh, swell name. She smiled. "You still say swell, just like when we were kids." And then it continues on from there. But that's a cool little thing of like, how would you find Repairman Jack? And it's like, oh, there's rumors, there's myths out there, and some people call him this, some people call him this. This was a reference I did look up. On page 147, Jack says, you know, oh, he remembered it all right, and this is about the secret history of the world. It had been hanging over his life like a Joe BTFSPLK cloud. I don't know how you're supposed to pronounce the last name, and I'm sure it's intentionally so. I had no idea what this was. So this is a comic strip of Lil Abner, who is a fairly affable guy, but he's just a jinx. Like, everything, bad stuff just follows him around, and like he's got a cloud over his head all the time. The comic strip ran from 1934 to 1977. It's before my time, so I didn't catch it, but I'm glad that I did, that I looked it up, because I was just like, is that a character in the series? How do I not know that name already? All right. The next one is on page 155. Weezy talks about the internet becoming the source of record instead of print newspapers. I just thought this was such an interesting thing that Wilson did here, that she collects all of these print newspapers because she's saying if somebody alters stuff online and people just trust the internet as being the record, then what will end up happening is, if you can alter the online record, you can essentially create false history. But print is basically, you can't do that unless you manipulate the image before it's ever printed. But if you can go back and find, you know, the actual newspaper, then you can see the real photograph, right? That is, it's kind of unsettling when you think about that, that if we entirely rely on the internet for records, then once those records are altered, that permanently changes it, unless there's a hard copy somewhere, and very few people do that now. So it's kind of an unsettling thought, the way she brings it up, of how we could be manipulated in certain ways. On page 162, you get this really beautiful description of Gia and how Jack feels about her. So he's talking to Weezy, and then you know, she was saying like, you know, oh, girls, like, they love the bad boy. And then he says, yeah, they do. But when you find a good woman and she makes you want to become a good man, or at least a better one, and so you try. And she was staring at him. What's her name? Gia. You say it like a prayer. I don't pray, but if I ever did, she'd be an answer. It's a really sweet description, and it's economical writing. It's very short, very brief, and it gets right to how Jack feels about Gia. And let's see, I mentioned that already, that Vieira or Glaken and the lady, that they were in Jack's hometown growing up to keep an eye on him. So again, this ties in so closely with the young adult book. You get so much mythology about the news sphere, the lady, her background, and I think that basically covers everything that I wanted to mention. So in general, you know, Ground Zero, it's an interesting book. I said it in my short review, in my short spoiler-free review. I think the first time that you're reading through the series, if you don't know all of this stuff, especially about who the lady is and the new sphere and the secret history of the world and all of that stuff, that you just want to get more information about it to get deeper into the lore of the story universe. So there's a lot of that. If you're reading it for a second or third time and you already know all of that stuff, then I think you might find with this book that it's not as compelling because there's far less action. There's not really a mystery to be solved, because as you're reading it, it's like, what really happened with September 11th? And you're like, well, obviously Rosalind was behind it and it's got to be tied into the conflict. And, you don't know exactly how or why, but it's presumed that it has to do with Opus Omega. So you're like, either they had to bury a column there or something, right? That was the only means to do so. I'm not saying it necessarily as a criticism, but as far as where it stands in the series, I would say it's much more of a secret history of the world book than, more of a thriller. Because I think By the Sword, the one that preceded this, is just such a great example of a thriller with lots and lots of action. So it's interesting that he follows up By the Sword, probably the most violent book, with one of the least violent books in the series, and something that really gets into the lore. And a lot of it, though, is continuing to set up and move forward in different ways and inform the reader of everything that they need to know as we move closer and closer to Night World, because we're now only a few books away. I think 3 books and then Night World. Initially it was 2, right? That it was Fatal Error, and then The Dark at the End, and then Night World. But now we have The Last Christmas, which is what I am going to dig into now that I've finished talking about Ground Zero. So you can look for my short spoiler-free review video for The Last Christmas, which I will post tomorrow, and then the longer discussion video, which I will post next Thursday. All right, folks, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye.